So in part 1 of chapter 2 on the pattern of evolution, we're going to first take a look at the overview of evolutionary patterns that we see. What you see here is taken from your outline. I want to remind you that every chapter I have an outline and objectives, and it helps to organize the information, which in my mind makes it a lot easier to learn. In this first part, what we're going to look at are some of the just very general introductory concepts that go along with evolution. We're going to talk about the difference between pattern and process as it applies to evolution, and then what does that key phrase descent with modification mean. That was one of Darwin's very early statements, one of the things he's most famous for coming up with. Contrary to popular belief, it was not survival of the fittest. That was not what he intended at all. It's been really misused. As with the term survival of the fittest, there is a lot of misconception there. In line with misconceptions, I have sort of silly little video to show you.
Oh, Sheldon!
What are they doing here?
Well, we came to apologize.
Again?
And bring you home. So why don't you pack up your stuff and we'll head back?
No, this is my home now. Thanks to you, my career is over. And I will spend the rest of my life here in Texas, trying to teach evolution to creationists.
You watch your mouth, Shelley. Everyone's entitled to their opinion.
Evolution isn't an opinion, it's fact.
And that is your opinion.
I forgive you. Let's go home.
Don't tell me prayer doesn't work.
So what do we mean by the pattern versus process in biology in general? So in other classes, you've clearly talked about this. You may have heard of it more described as form versus function. So if you've had anatomy and physiology, you talked about muscle structure. You looked at the arrangement of myofilaments, and in cells, you look at mitochondria or chloroplast, and then you also correlate that back to the function of that cell or that muscle tissue. So we know that those things go hand in hand. So pattern and process is very similar to saying form versus function. When we are looking at it in terms of evolutionary biology, what we're thinking about with the pattern is describe to me what it looked like. Maybe you saw a mass extinction event. Maybe you saw a massive speciation event that occurred after a mass extinction. You're describing the patterns that you see. And they don't just have to be historical. You could be describing to me the different species and how they're distributed across the globe. We have higher species diversity at the equator. And then as you increase in latitude away from the equator, species diversity drops. That's a pattern. So pattern is really just describing what's there. What does it look like? And then process is trying to tell us how it came to be that way. From evolutionary perspective, the pattern part is again describing either historical events or patterns that we see when we look at species distributions, etc. today, and we look at phylogenetic trees, let's say, and we see patterns of relatedness. And then the process component is really asking, how did that happen? So think of evolutionary biology a lot like forensic biology, because an awful lot of what we are trying to reconstruct, we weren't there to witness, and so we are trying to see the pattern that's in front of us and reconstruct that history, and we're trying to reconstruct that process that got us there. So the two main patterns that we will see. Now, there's a lot that fall within this, but the two main patterns we see are species change over time and species give rise to new species. Now, one of the things that I think it's important to think about here is why would they have picked these as the patterns? Remember, one of the things they're also trying to establish is evolution as a fact. How do we know that evolution occurs? You have to kind of put yourself also a little bit back in the minds of the people that were coming up with this, like Darwin at the time, where there was a very different line of thought. The line of thought there was that every species was just created independently, individually. They weren't related to one another at all, and no new species arose and species didn't go extinct. And so by coming up and saying, oh, wait a minute, species aren't these immutable entities, they do change, and we do get the formation of new species, and of course we also know that we see the loss of species. So what about the major process that we see in evolution? How do we account for those changes over time and that rise of new species? Well, the major pattern is of course going to be natural selection. So we will look at later chapters about other types of processes that can generate evolution. You can see a lot of the patterns that we're getting ready to look at that are not necessarily caused by natural selection. We can have things caused by genetic drift, migration, mutation, and some other things that we'll look at a little bit more in depth when we get to chapters 6 and 7. But one of the reasons why natural selection is usually put forth as the major one is because natural selection is the evolutionary process that often results in adaptation. The other processes like genetic drift often do not result in adaptation. They are random changes that happen, and it might make an individual better suited to its environment, or it might make it worse suited to its environment. And so sometimes those changes don't persist, because if it made them not as good at living in this environment, then that particular change would be gone. So selection kind of generates these differences that we actually see persisting more through time. Not only is it probably a stronger force in most large populations, but it also is something that we see the evidence for because it persists over time and we don't lose it like we would some of the other mechanisms. So we see that species do change over time and they give rise to new species. So one of the ways that Darwin encapsulated that concept is he talked about descent with modification. So species descend from other species. They don't pop out of thin air. They become modified. They change over time. And so one of the things that we'll look at within this is almost 3 different time frames that you can imagine that this modification occurs over. We have microevolution, and then you see on here speciation, and then you also see macroevolution. These are looking at sort of slightly different time scales. So microevolution is occurring on a small time scale and typically also a small spatial scale, or at least it's typically at the level of a population. If I look at a population and that population 20 years ago had mostly brown colored mice and now they're mostly tan colored mice, that mouse population has changed. That was the process of microevolution. So we're looking at small scale changes over time and with respect to the entity that is affected. In this case, it's a population or an individual species, not lots of different species. Then we can kind of go one next step and say, okay, sometimes when you get these changes, you also can get the formation of a new species from a pre-existing species. Imagine we have a population that something happens to it and we split it in some way, and some of the individuals become different from the original population, and eventually they become so different that they don't mate with one another anymore, and so now they really are 2 independent species. And so that's this process of forming new species, which we will return to in chapter 16 on speciation. And then the next step we have is a huge leap. So from microevolution to speciation is a fairly small step, but from speciation then to macroevolution is huge, because now in macroevolution you're looking at large scale changes over long periods of time and usually over large taxonomic scales. So rather than just looking at species, you might be looking at the diversification of an entire phylum. So you're looking at big scale changes, both time and taxonomically. So macroevolution would typically deal with things like mass extinctions, massive adaptive radiation that happens. So if you looked at the Cambrian explosion, where you had lots and lots of new species forming, and then if you look at some of those mass extinctions, like when we lost the dinosaurs, etc., then that kind of thing would come into macroevolution. So we don't spend a whole lot of time in the course on macroevolution. We spend a lot more of our time understanding those processes that give rise to microevolution, and then a little bit of time to speciation.